My father-in-law tried to buy me off to divorce his daughter. I recorded everything and played it at family dinner. The coffee shop was practically empty that Tuesday morning when my father-in-law slid into the booth across from me. His expensive suit looked out of place among the worn vinyl seats and chipped formica tables. The way he drummed his manicured fingers on the table told me this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation about the weather or upcoming family barbecue. I'd been married to his daughter for 3 years by then, and our relationship had always been strained. Not because I was a bad husband or anything like that, quite the opposite actually. I worked hard, treated his daughter like a queen, and never caused any drama at family gatherings. But there was something about me that rubbed him the wrong way, something that made him look at me like I was tracking mud through his pristine world. Maybe it was because I didn't come from money. My parents were good people who worked honest jobs, but we weren't country club material. My father-in-law had built his wealth through decades of shrewd business dealings, and he seemed to think that anyone who hadn't done the same was somehow lesser. The fact that his daughter had fallen for a regular guy instead of someone from his social circle clearly ate at him. The tension had been building for months. Little comments here and there about my career prospects, subtle digs about our modest apartment, pointed questions about when I planned to really make something of myself. My wife would defend me, which only seemed to make things worse. I could see the frustration in his eyes every time she chose my side over his disapproval. So when he called and asked to meet for coffee, claiming he wanted to discuss something important, I knew it wasn't going to be good news. Still, I couldn't have predicted what came next. He started off casual enough, asking about work and making small talk about the unusually cold weather we'd been having. But I could see the calculation behind his eyes, the way he was measuring his words and timing his approach. This was a man who'd spent his life closing deals and manipulating situations to his advantage. Then he got to the point. He pulled out a leather portfolio and set it on the table between us, his fingers resting on top like he was guarding state secrets. The way he looked at me in that moment, like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person, made my stomach turn. He explained that he'd been thinking about my future, about what would be best for everyone involved. His daughter deserved someone who could provide for her in the way she was accustomed to, someone who understood her world and could give her the life she deserved. I wasn't that person, and we both knew it. The numbers he threw out were staggering. Enough money to pay off my student loans, buy a house, start fresh somewhere new. All I had to do was walk away from my marriage and never contact his daughter again. Clean break, no mess, no drama. He'd even help me relocate to another state if I wanted, set me up with connections for a better job. My hands started shaking as the reality of what he was proposing sank in. This wasn't just about money, this was about control, about removing what he saw as an obstacle to his perfect vision of his daughter's life. The casual way he laid out the terms, like he was negotiating a business contract, made my blood run cold. I managed to keep my voice steady as I asked clarifying questions, playing along while my mind raced. How exactly would this work? When would I receive the money? What story would we tell his daughter? He had answers for everything, clearly having thought this through in detail. That's when I realized my phone had been recording the entire conversation. I'd started a voice memo app earlier that morning to record some thoughts for a work project and never turned it off. Pure luck, but it captured every word of his proposition. The next few hours were a blur of emotions. Anger, disgust, betrayal, but also a strange sense of vindication. All those months of feeling like I wasn't good enough, like I was somehow failing his daughter by not being wealthy or connected enough, and here was proof that the problem wasn't me at all. It was him and his twisted priorities. I drove home in a daze, the recording playing over and over in my head. My wife was at work, so I had the apartment to myself to process what had just happened. I sat on our couch, staring at the framed photos of our wedding day, remembering how uncomfortable he'd looked during the ceremony. Now it all made sense. The hardest part was deciding what to do with the information. I could have confronted him privately, demanded an apology, threatened to tell his daughter. But something about the calculated cruelty of his approach made me want to expose him publicly. He'd been undermining our marriage from the shadows for years, and I was tired of pretending everything was fine. My wife came home that evening in a good mood, chatting about her day and asking about my coffee meeting with her father. I told her it went fine, that we just talked about general stuff. The lie felt terrible, but I needed time to plan my next move. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay awake thinking about the implications of what I'd learned. This wasn't just about money or social status, it was about a father who was willing to destroy his daughter's happiness to maintain his idea of what her life should look like. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Over the next few days, I found myself watching my father-in-law differently at family gatherings. The way he interacted with his daughter, the pointed looks he gave me, the comments that seemed innocent on the surface but carried hidden meaning. It was like seeing behind a mask, understanding the real motivations behind his behavior. My wife noticed that something was off. I was quieter than usual, distracted during conversations, less engaged with her family. She asked several times if everything was okay, if something was bothering me. I assured her it was just work stress, but I could see the concern in her eyes. The breaking point came 2 weeks later at a family dinner. We were all gathered around the dining room table, my wife, her parents, her younger brother, and her grandmother who was visiting from out of state. It was supposed to be a celebration of her grandmother's birthday, a happy family occasion. But my father-in-law couldn't resist taking shots at me throughout the meal. Comments about my career prospects, suggestions that I wasn't ambitious enough, veiled criticisms disguised as concern for his daughter's future. Each jab felt like a knife twist, especially knowing what he'd tried to do behind everyone's back. The final straw came when he started telling the table about a young man from his country club whose family had recently moved to town. Successful, well-educated, from a good family, exactly the kind of person his daughter should be spending time with. The implication was clear, and the way he looked at me while describing this perfect specimen made my blood boil. That's when I made my decision. I excused myself from the table, claiming I needed to take an important call. Instead, I went to my car and retrieved the small Bluetooth speaker I kept in my glove compartment. I transferred the recording to my phone days earlier, knowing this moment might come. When I returned to the dining room, I set the speaker on the table and announced that I had something important to share with everyone. The confused looks around the table would have been funny under different circumstances. My father-in-law's face went pale as he realized what was about to happen. I pressed play and watched the room transform as my father-in-law's voice filled the space, laying out his offer in stark detail. The gasps of shock, the sound of my wife's chair scraping against the floor as she stood up, the way her grandmother's hand flew to her mouth in horror, it was like watching a bomb explode in slow motion. The recording played for several minutes, capturing not just the initial offer but also the casual way he discussed manipulating his daughter's emotions, his certainty that I would eventually accept because everyone had a price. His detailed plans for covering up the whole arrangement. When it ended, the silence was deafening. My wife stood frozen behind her chair, tears streaming down her face as she stared at her father. Her mother looked like she'd been slapped, her face cycling through confusion, anger, and betrayal. Even her usually composed grandmother sat with her mouth agape, unable to process what she'd just heard. My father-in-law tried to salvage the situation, claiming the recording was taken out of context, that I'd misunderstood his intentions. But the audio was crystal clear, leaving no room for misinterpretation. His attempts at explanation only made things worse, each word digging him deeper into the hole he'd created. The explosion of emotion that followed was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. My wife screamed at her father, her voice raw with pain and fury. Her mother demanded to know how he could do such a thing to his own daughter. Her brother sat in stunned silence, looking like he was seeing his father for the first time. But it was her grandmother's reaction that hit hardest. This woman who'd raised her family with dignity and respect, who'd always spoken proudly of her son's success, looked at him with such disappointment that it was painful to watch. She stood up slowly, her frail frame somehow commanding the entire room's attention, and told him that she was ashamed to call him her son. The aftermath was swift and brutal. My father-in-law's attempts to justify his actions only made things worse. He claimed he was protecting his daughter, that he could see I wasn't right for her, that he was just trying to prevent future heartbreak. But his words rang hollow in the face of the cold calculation revealed in the recording. My wife demanded that he leave, her voice shaking with rage and hurt. When he hesitated, her mother, quiet, diplomatic woman who'd always played peacemaker, stood up and told him to get out of her house. The look of betrayal on her face was devastating, and I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about a husband who'd been willing to destroy his daughter's marriage without even consulting his wife. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of family drama and emotional fallout. My wife went through stages of grief, anger, and confusion as she processed what her father had done. Some days she was furious, other days she was heartbroken, and sometimes she just seemed numb. Her relationship with her father was shattered. He tried repeatedly to reach out, sending flowers, leaving voicemails, even showing up at our apartment uninvited. But my wife refused to see him, refused to take his calls, refused to engage with his attempts at reconciliation. The ripple effects spread through the extended family. Relatives who heard about what happened took sides, some supporting my wife's decision to cut contact, others arguing that family was family and forgiveness was important. Holiday gatherings became minefields of tension and awkward silences. My mother-in-law found herself caught in the middle, torn between her husband and her daughter. She'd built her life around keeping the family together, and watching it fall apart was destroying her. She tried to mediate to find some path forward, but the damage was too deep. The most unexpected consequence came from my wife's brother. He'd always been the golden child, the one who followed in their father's footsteps and shared his values. But hearing that recordings seemed to open his eyes to aspects of their father's character he'd never acknowledged before. He started questioning other family decisions, other moments when their father had manipulated situations to get his way. 3 months after the dinner from hell, my wife made a decision that surprised everyone. She decided to write a letter to her father, not to forgive him or rebuild their relationship, but to explain exactly how his actions had affected her and what she needed from him moving forward. The letter was brutal in its honesty. She detailed how his constant criticism had made her question her own judgment, how his disapproval had poisoned happy moments in our marriage, how his willingness to buy off her husband had made her feel like a possession rather than a person. She explained that any future relationship would depend on him acknowledging the full extent of his wrongdoing and making genuine changes to his behavior. His response was disappointing but not surprising. He sent back a formal apology that read like it was written by a lawyer, acknowledging his mistakes while still trying to justify his motivations. He claimed he'd acted out of love and concern, that he'd only wanted what was best for his daughter. But there was no real accountability, no genuine remorse for the pain he'd caused. The situation took another unexpected turn when my wife decided to see a family counselor, not to work on forgiveness or reconciliation, but to process the trauma of discovering that her father had been willing to destroy her marriage for money. The sessions helped her understand that this wasn't really about me at all, but about her father's need to control every aspect of her life. As she worked through her feelings, she began to see patterns in their relationship that she'd never recognized before. The way he'd always pushed her towards certain friends and away from others, the subtle ways he'd undermined her confidence in her own decisions, the financial strings he'd used to maintain influence over her choices. The counseling also helped her understand that my decision to expose him publicly, while painful, had been necessary. She realized that if I'd approached him privately, he would have found ways to manipulate the situation, possibly even turning her against me by claiming I was trying to extort him. 6 months after the recording was played, we got news that changed everything. My father-in-law had been arrested for fraud in connection with some of his business dealings. Apparently, his willingness to solve problems with money extended beyond family matters, and he'd been using similar tactics to manipulate business partners and competitors. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who tried to buy off his daughter's husband to maintain his family's reputation was now facing prison time for essentially the same behavior in his professional life. The news vindicated my wife's decision to cut contact, showing that his actions toward me were part of a broader pattern of manipulation and control. The arrest also revealed financial problems we'd never known about. His lavish lifestyle and generous offers had been funded partly by money that wasn't his to spend. The realization that he'd tried to buy me off with stolen money added another layer of betrayal to an already devastating situation. My wife's reaction to the news was complex. Part of her felt vindicated, seeing that her father's character flaws extended far beyond their family situation. But part of her was also devastated, watching the man she'd once looked up to fall from grace so completely. The legal proceedings dragged on for months, with my father-in-law's face appearing regularly in the local news as more details of his fraudulent activities came to light. My wife struggled with the public nature of his disgrace, feeling like she was being judged by association even though she'd already cut ties with him. During this time, something unexpected happened. My relationship with my mother-in-law began to improve dramatically. She'd initially been cold toward me after the recording incident, clearly struggling with the chaos it had brought to her family. But as the extent of her husband's deception became clear, she began to see me differently. She started reaching out more, inviting us to lunch, asking about our lives in ways she never had before. It was like she was discovering who I really was for the first time, no longer seeing me through the lens of her husband's disapproval. She even apologized for the years of subtle hostility, admitting that she'd been influenced by his constant criticism. The transformation in our relationship was remarkable. She became one of our strongest supporters, often commenting on how happy her daughter seemed despite everything that had happened. She'd apparently been so focused on maintaining family harmony that she'd never really looked at our marriage objectively. My wife's grandmother also became an unexpected ally. She'd always been polite but distant, clearly sharing some of her son's concerns about my background. But after hearing the recording and witnessing the subsequent revelations about his character, she made a point of getting to know me better. During one memorable visit, she pulled me aside and told me that she'd been wrong about me, that she could see how much I loved her granddaughter and how hard I worked to make her happy. She even shared stories about her own marriage, how she'd married my wife's grandfather despite her family's objections because she knew he was a good man. A year after the family dinner that changed everything, my father-in-law was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The courtroom was packed with people whose lives he'd affected, business partners he'd cheated, employees he'd manipulated, family members he'd betrayed. My wife chose not to attend, but she read about it in the news like everyone else. The sentencing brought a strange sense of closure to the whole situation. Justice had been served, not just for us but for all the people he'd harmed over the years. My wife felt like a weight had been lifted, knowing that his actions had finally caught up with him. But the most significant change wasn't about him at all, it was about us. Going through this experience together had strengthened our marriage in ways I never expected. We'd faced the ultimate test of loyalty and trust, and we'd come through it stronger than ever. My wife often talked about how the experience had changed her perspective on family and relationships. She'd learned that blood relationships didn't automatically deserve loyalty, that trust had to be earned and maintained. She'd also learned to value authenticity over appearances, substance over status. The recording incident had also taught me something important about standing up for myself and my marriage. For years, I'd tolerated my father-in-law's subtle hostility because I didn't want to cause problems for my wife. But staying silent had only enabled his behavior to escalate. 2 years later, we received an unexpected letter from prison. My father-in-law had written to apologize, this time with what seemed like genuine remorse. He acknowledged the pain he'd caused, admitted that his actions had been wrong, and asked for nothing in return, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just the chance to express his regret. The letter was different from his previous attempts at communication. It was handwritten, personal, and raw in its honesty. He talked about how prison had given him time to reflect on his choices, how he'd realized that his need to control everything had destroyed the relationships that mattered most to him. My wife read the letter several times before deciding how to respond. She ultimately chose to write back, not to forgive or forget, but to acknowledge his apology and let him know that we were doing well. She made it clear that she wasn't ready for any kind of relationship, but she appreciated his honest admission of wrongdoing. The letter exchange didn't lead to reconciliation, but it did provide some closure. My wife felt like she'd finally gotten the acknowledgement she'd needed, even if it came too late to repair their relationship. She was able to let go of some of the anger she'd been carrying, not for his sake but for her own peace of mind. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd handled the situation differently. What if I'd confronted him privately instead of exposing him publicly? What if I'd never recorded the conversation at all? But I've come to believe that the truth would have come out eventually in some form or another. The experience taught me that sometimes the most difficult decisions are also the most necessary ones. Recording that conversation and playing it at family dinner was brutal, but it exposed a pattern of manipulation that had been poisoning our family for years. It was painful for everyone involved, but it was also liberating. My wife and I are happier now than we've ever been. We've built a life together based on mutual respect and genuine love, free from the toxic influence of someone who never accepted our relationship. We've learned to trust each other completely, to communicate openly about difficult topics, and to prioritize our marriage above all other relationships. The support we received from her mother and grandmother also showed us what healthy family relationships could look like. They demonstrated that love doesn't require control, that you can disagree with someone's choices while still supporting them, and that family bonds can actually grow stronger through honest communication. Sometimes I still think about that coffee shop conversation, about the moment when I realized what my father-in-law was proposing. The shock and disgust I felt then has faded into something more like pity. He'd been so focused on money and status that he'd lost sight of what really mattered, his daughter's happiness and the strength of their family bonds. The recording that changed everything still sits on my phone, though I've never played it again. It serves as a reminder of how far we've come and how important it is to stand up for what's right, even when it's painful. It's also a testament to the power of truth, even when that truth is ugly and difficult to face. Our marriage survived the ultimate test, and we're stronger for having gone through it together. We learned that we could face anything as long as we faced it as a team, with honesty and trust as our foundation. The money he offered seems laughably small now compared to what we've built together, a relationship based on genuine love and mutual respect. The family dinners are quieter now, but they're also more peaceful. There's no underlying tension, no walking on eggshells, no wondering when the next subtle insult will come. We can focus on enjoying each other's company without the toxic undercurrent that had poisoned so many previous gatherings. In the end, my father-in-law's attempt to buy me off backfired spectacularly. Instead of destroying our marriage, it ultimately made it stronger. Instead of driving us apart, it brought us closer together. And instead of maintaining his control over the family, it cost him his place in it entirely. The recording played at that family dinner will forever be a turning point in our lives, the moment when truth triumphed over manipulation, when love proved stronger than money. And when we learned that sometimes the most painful decisions are also the most necessary ones.